Okay, recording in progress.
Andata.
Okay. Okay, after this tragedy, we can communicate that officially we can start. Welcome to everyone. We are very, very glad and grateful to have Mohamed here. Really, we are honored and humbled to have Mohamed. Mohamed Abdou is a brother and friend, and we're very grateful. Alhamdulillah. Today, Moschea Al-Kawthar, so and Sono l'unica mia, the collective, will open this event about Islam and anarchism. As you already know, we define ourselves Islamic feminists and anarchists. So it's such an honor to have here in our home. I won't define you a guest because you're already at home. Mohamed Abdou. Mohamed Abdou is the author of Islam and Anarchism, this wonderful book that we, of course, recommend to everyone. And Islam and Anarchism is really a decolonial, queer, feminist work on spirituality. With the Islam and Anarchism, we challenge the idea that also in Italy we have, and it's very strong as an idea, that anarchism can be spiritual. In Italy, we have a lot of trauma with the religion, and this trauma led us to reject every form of spirituality, and in particular monotheistic religions. So we have a long story actually with, for example, the anarchist Christianity. We have also a story with Leda Rafanelli. Leda Rafanelli was a Muslim anarchist. She's our ancestor, the ancestor that we should, how can I say, we should pray for her. So really, we have something to tell, but we have a lot of to hear, because we lost our traditions, our anarchist traditions. Anarchism is not in Italy, but not also in Italy, rejecting spirituality and Christianity, but is also rejecting Islam in a very, very intense way. Why? Because of racism, because of Islamophobia. So we are here to challenge a lot of prejudice, a lot of discrimination systems. And that's really a wonderful occasion. We hope to do it again. I really hope to do it again, even if we are starting, okay? And the event will consist on this introduction. I'm Bessira. She's Fatumata. My shadow at the moment, and Fatumata will translate the khutba of Mohamed Abdou. And then Mohamed, I believe in self-determination, so I will let Mohamed introducing himself and not selves, maybe one himself, and then I will hear both your voices. I'm really excited about it. So thank you, Mohamed, to be here, and please make us hear your voice.
Let me begin
by first of all thanking the collective and Masjid Al-Kawthar, Fatumata for her labor uh, in advance with regards to translating, um, Basira for the invitation. Um, oh, excuse me. And allow me to begin by saying I'm very humbled and honored to be invited by you all and for your audience. This might be a long khutbah because of the translation, um, but I pray it's beneficial. I'll start off by saying, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. I take refuge from the evil that tempts us away from truth. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of Allah, the compassionate, the infinitely loving. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Praise belongs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the sustainer of the words. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا رسول الله عبده ورسوله. I bear witness before everybody that is here that there is no deity except Allah, who is one and without partner, and I bear witness that Muhammad is their beloved, is the beloved of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and their messenger. Blessings and peace on Muhammad, the messenger of Allah, and their purified family, and their worthy and good companions, and peace upon you all. O worshippers of Allah and myself, maintain due reverence towards Allah, maintain due love towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I usually begin all my talks by reciting the words and the prayer of Musa alayhi salam in the Quran when he was about to meet Pharaoh. Musa alayhi salam said, Allahumma shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. O Allah, Allahumma shrah li sadri, open thy breast, wa yassir li amri, and make my affairs easy. Wahlul uqdatan min lisani, and undo the knot in my tongue, such that what it is that I have to share with all of you becomes accessible and reaches you. Fatumata, let me know when you would like me to pause.
Okay. Continue a little bit, then I will try to maybe have a summary. Have a summary, yeah.
Okay.
We will add the subtitles after, so don't worry. Go.
Okay. I begin by saying that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created our species and this earth with our responsibility as khulafa, as caretakers of this land. And we've inhabited this land continuously for over 15,000 years. I have to also acknowledge, given the distance between you and me, where I'm speaking from. I'm not speaking from my country. I don't identify with the state. In fact, I don't identify with any state. I was born in Egypt, but I don't even identify with the Egyptian state. I am against all states, be it Israel, be it the United States, be it Canada, be it even the prospect of a Palestinian state. And because I am here in what is referred to as the United States, it becomes very important for me to acknowledge where I'm speaking from. I'm speaking from stolen land. Indigenous people have taught me, and my indigenous elders have taught me, because there's a perception that indigenous people are all dead. Indigenous people have taught me that it is important to engage in land back acknowledgements, because indigenous people deserve to have their land back. This is stolen land that I'm living on. And land acknowledgements, you'll see a lot of people nowadays giving land acknowledgements. I'm on XYZ territory right now. I am on Lene Lenape territory. I'm on stolen land. And empire, particularly Euro-American empire, loves euphemisms, loves to manipulate words. And language is power, no? And empire uses, it's a very George Orwellian moment that we live now, because we live in a world of slogans. In Tahrir Square that I lived, the uprisings, the revolution of 2011, and I've been involved in movement organizing for maybe over 20 years, maybe even more than that. After the Seattle anti-globalization movement in 1999, with the Zapatistas in Chiapas, in Mexico, with indigenous land defending, with the indigenous people here, with abolition, Black liberationist and self-determining groups and movements. But we live in a world of slogans. In Tahrir, people screamed bread, freedom, and social justice. Now people are screaming from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Slogans. Slogans don't liberate. Slogans are not revolutionary. So these are very troubling times, because George Orwell's prophecy of 1984 of doublespeak has come to fulfillment, to fruition. George Orwell said, first they steal the words, then they steal the meanings. Words have been placed on our tongues that we don't know the meanings of, and I'll be speaking about some of these words today. How Islam is mistranslated, how we say fascism, although fascism is a mass psychology, how anarchism is translated as anarchy, as chaos, as disorder. There are other words: axis of evil, war against terror, simulated drowning, preventive war. What is a preventive war? Civilians killed are referred to as casualties of war. They're referred to as collateral damage. CIA kidnappings, when the CIA kidnaps, they refer to this as extraordinary renditions. Sun Tzu had said, if you fail to recognize the scope and the nature of the enemy, you will succumb in every
When you
battle.
can, have a pause. When you can. Va bene, faccio un po' di riassunto per cominciare. Allora, per cominciare, Mohamed Abdou ci ha ringraziati, ha ringraziato Sfida per l'introduzione, ha ringraziato noi per la traduzione e è contento di avere questo pubblico e di essere qui. Ha introdotto la sua khutba con alcune invocazioni come Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, o la shahada, la testimonianza di fede. E poi ha iniziato il suo discorso parlando di come Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ha creato la nostra specie e la terra, e ha introdotto la nozione di khulafa, cioè di coloro che si prendono cura della terra, e ha subito detto che lui non parla dal proprio paese, ma non si identifica con nessuno stato, né con l'Egitto con cui è nato, né soprattutto con gli United States, cioè gli Stati Uniti d'America, che sono una potenza imperialista, ma neanche con, per esempio, Israele, ma nemmeno con un possibile futuro Stato di Palestina. Negli Stati Uniti lui vive in una terra che è stata rubata. Le persone indigene ci insegnano che è importante il concetto della restituzione delle terre, che è una cosa che va riconosciuta, perché cioè lui adesso per esempio vive nell'English Territory, nel territorio di questo popolo. La potenza imperialista degli Stati Uniti manipola le parole. Infatti oggi viviamo in un mondo di slogan. Per esempio nei movimenti di Piazza Tahrir degli anni 2010-11 gli slogan erano pane, libertà, giustizia e sociale. Adesso per esempio con i movimenti della Palestina c'è dal fiume fino al mare la Palestina sarà libera. I movimenti si organizzano da tantissimo tempo, già da Seattle e dal Chiapas. Ci sono dei movimenti di autodeterminazioni, ma dall'altra parte il fascismo psicologico di massa che impone slogan è molto forte. Per esempio sono introdotti concetti come la guerra contro il terrorismo o le guerre preventive o per esempio i rapimenti di persone per interrogarle erano chiamate extraordinary rendition, e questo fa sì che appunto si viva in un mondo di slogan dove c'è questo fascismo psicologico molto forte che nutre l'imperialismo. Andiamo?
Who start? Please go.
Sun Tzu had wrote, if you fail to recognize the scope and nature of the enemy, you will succumb in every battle. Sadly, we don't know what we are fighting, and we don't know what we are fighting for. A lot of people say, and we need to, of course, a lot of people say that we need to end systematic and institutional violence. The fascistic violence but there's also the fascistic violence that we enact upon one another. You see, fascism is a mass psychology, and we replicate it, we produce it every day on a horizontal level, on the streets. For example, the sexism, the racism, the state, the condition of the state that we have internalized. It makes no difference then, because fascism has to deal with a structure, the state structure and capitalist structure. It makes no difference if we have in power Giorgia Meloni, Giuseppe Conte, Paolo Gentiloni. Even though they may be of different political parties, the structure remains the same. The state is not an abstract entity that exists over and above us. The state teaches us to govern and discipline our own bodies, as well as to govern and discipline in authoritarian ways everything that is around us. The state is our actual father. Our mother is capitalism. She teaches us to materialize everything. For example, love, to be celebrated on Valentine's Day in Hallmark cards. Queer pride, with Heineken bottles and corporate materialization of queer practices. This becomes the psyche that we internalize, that we reproduce, that of our father, that of our mother. And this is how we replicate sexism, racism, patriarchy in our everyday relations with each other. This is how we engage in a competition between struggles. Who is more oppressed than who? It becomes important from my context, then, to center the fact that I don't live in any kind of state. I live in a settler colonial state, just as much as Israel is a settler colonial state. And I will speak later as to what settler colonialism is. But because it is a settler colonial state, it means that I need to center indigenous people in my own struggles, in our struggles. Those of us who are not indigenous people and who are not descendants of the transatlantic Middle Passage, the process and the project of enslavement, are settlers. I am a settler on stolen land. And I benefit, and settlers benefit from occupation, from colonization, from an ongoing genocide of indigenous people, because the genocide here has not ended. Settlers, like myself, benefit from the fact that indigenous people continue to be kidnapped, from their forced labor, and so on and so forth. Immigrants, Muslims and non-Muslims, don't or seem to believe or don't seem to comprehend, don't seem to understand that American society is animated by white supremacist religious doctrines. For example, manifest destiny, the doctrine of discovery, terra nullius, Protestant ethic that informs common law property rights, how property is conceived, Victorian notions of gender and sexuality. Secularism doesn't exist. Secularism masks the Christian ethos, the European Christian ethos, because Christianity is an Eastern tradition that was appropriated underneath Constantine and weaponized as an imperial tool of conquest. There is no American dream. As Malcolm X said, there's only an American nightmare. I'll stop there and maybe Fatumata.
Non ti sentiamo.
Porca miseria.
Già. Ok,
Vabbè.
allora Mohamed Abdou ha detto che è importante riconoscere lo scopo e il nemico in ogni battaglia e molto spesso non sappiamo chi combattiamo e chi aspettiamo. La violenza istituzionale e sistematica deve essere posta a termine in queste battaglie. Il fascismo è una psicologia di massa che riproduce ogni giorno, si riproduce orizzontalmente anche grazie ai nostri comportamenti per quanto riguardano per esempio il sessismo o il razzismo. Ha a che vedere molto con lo Stato e il capitalismo. Infatti lo Stato non è una struttura astratta, ma è una realtà concreta che disciplina i corpi e la realtà. Mohamed Abdou ha fatto l'esempio di, per esempio, i vari politici italiani, da Meloni a Conte a Gentiloni, sono stati diversi capi del governo, ma alla fine lo Stato è sempre lo stesso e lo Stato può essere visto un po' come il padre, mentre il capitalismo è la madre, cioè è questa presenza onnipresente che tende a uniformare molto anche per esempio il desiderio, gli aspetti psicologici, come ad esempio, non lo so, nell'amore, la queerness, San Valentino, una serie di fenomeni commercializzati. E in questo modo questi sistemi li riproduciamo tra noi e creiamo molto spesso una competizione tra oppressioni diversi. In solo un contesto settler coloniale, stati settler coloniali sono per esempio gli Stati Uniti o Israele, e quindi nella lotta è importante centrare l'indipendenza dei popoli indigeni. Chi non è indigeno e non è discendente della tratta di schiavi transatlantica è un colonizzatore di popolamento, anche lui è un settler colonizzatore. Infatti, queste persone, chi è settler colonizzatore, beneficia per certi versi della colonizzazione e del genocidio. Per esempio, che il genocidio è ancora in corso, si può vedere per esempio nei rapimenti delle persone indigene che sono costanti, oppure nei lavori forzati che continuano a esserci diseguaglianze. Molto spesso le persone immigrate in questi contesti e anche i musulmani sembrano non capire che quella è una società coloniale, ricadono nel sogno americano, in idee quali la proprietà e anche un secolarismo di massa che in realtà maschera il cristianesimo. Il cristianesimo non è di per sé una tradizione occidentale, è una tradizione orientale che è stata appropriata dall'Occidente con Costantino, però nella forma europeanizzata e americanizzata appunto viene mascherata dal secolarismo negli stati settler coloniali. Come dice Malcolm X, non c'è nessun sogno americano, c'è solo l'incubo americano.
Please.
On this land, what is referred to as Turtle Island, there were over 100 million indigenous people. Now, they constitute 2% of the US population. I will speak about that history in a little bit and why 1492 is a very important year. But indigenous people have been subjected to residential schools, starvation. They have had bounties on their scalps. They have been subjected to police shootings, incarceration, the theft of their land. The indigenous children have been placed in foster care. They are referred to in the US Declaration of Independence as merciless Indian savages. Indigenous people were placed in boarding school systems in which they were not allowed to speak their own language. Children were not allowed to speak their own language. They were separated from their families, and this was part of federal policy in order to steal indigenous land. There were over 408 boarding institutions or boarding schools between 1819 and 1969. These institutions were run by churches and religious organizations. Indigenous children were murdered and were killed and were placed in at least 50 mass burial sites. The burial sites are unmarked, and we are still discovering these burial sites up until this day. Indigenous people are forgotten, and they only become remembered when football teams are named after them. American football teams are named after them. For example, the Washington Redskins, the Chiefs, or their names are placed on weapons of mass destruction, like Tomahawk weapons and Apache helicopters. But this land is also founded on slavery. Slavery that is continuing to this day. Police brutality against Black people. What is referred to as stop and frisk policies. School to prison nexus and pipelines. Impoverishment. Premature deaths. 1994 crime bills, which Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders voted for, and that referred to Black youth as super predators, as thugs, within a shattered criminal justice system. Do you want to translate, Fatimata?
Ok, allora Mohamed Abdou ha parlato un po' sia del problema degli indigeni sia del problema delle persone nere negli Stati Uniti. Per quanto, vabbè, l'America, Turtle Island, in America vivono 100 milioni di persone indigene, che sono il 2% della popolazione, e però sono sono state forzate a subire grosse violenze, come per esempio le scuole residenziali, subire la fame, persecuzioni da parte della polizia, incarcerazioni, deportazioni. Per quanto riguarda le scuole residenziali, i bambini venivano divisi dalle famiglie, sottratti, e non era consentito che parlassero la loro lingua. Tra il 1819 e il 1969 le chiese e le organizzazioni hanno appunto condotto queste scuole. Tanti bambini morivano o venivano uccisi, e ci sono ancora dei luoghi di sepoltura non sconosciuti. E le persone indigene sono dimenticate e molto spesso sono ricordate solo nei nomi delle squadre di football americano, che sono basate su le armi di distruzione di massa che venivano applicate.
Sulle armi di distruzione di massa, tipo elicotteri, bombe.
Esatto. E poi, oltre a essere una terra fondata sul genocidio delle persone indigene, gli Stati Uniti è una terra fondata sulla schiavitù, sulla brutalità della polizia, su un sistema dalla scuola alla prigione per le persone nere, sul loro impoverimento, sulla loro criminalizzazione, che è stata operata per esempio negli anni 90 anche da Hillary Clinton e Bernie Sanders, che definivano i giovani ragazzi neri dei criminali. Ecco, questo.
There are three moments, or there are three things in this day and age that distinguish the conditions that we live in than any other time. Number one, our Mother Earth. Our Mother Earth has her own timetable and schedule. Our Mother Earth that we raped, that we pillaged, we have now climate change, we have global warming. And our Mother Earth has her own timetable and schedule. She does not distinguish between an indigenous land defender and a white supremacist. And that doesn't make her any less rational or reasonable. Number two, we are scrolling and have become conditioned to scroll through genocide on phone. a phone that is made by copper and cobalt from another genocide in the Congo, assembled by another ethnic cleansing by Uyghur in China. Number 3, that as a species, we have developed weapons of mass destruction to create Hiroshimas and Nagasaki's in an instant and a moment. Now, it is very ironic, and now this is where I perhaps will begin to speak. How is this all relevant to Islam and anarchism? It is very ironic, given number 1, the land, our Mother Earth, that there are so many chapters in the Quran that are named after Mother Earth. The chapter of the moon, chapter of the sun, the chapter of the thunder, the chapter of the spider, the chapter of the mountain, the chapter of the stars, the chapter of the night, the chapter of the elephant, the chapter of the bees, the chapter of the ants. What is the purpose of this? And why aren't Muslims reflecting insofar as their responsibilities to non-human life, to other than non-human life? We perceive ourselves as being on top of the food chain. But without land, we would not be able to breathe. We would not be able to eat. Actually, we are at the very bottom of the food chain. And yet, our species has become so arrogant. Muslims do not reflect upon the responsibility to other than non-human life, despite the fact that in the Quran, many chapters are written and named after non-human life. When I was going to give the khutbah today, there were 3 options. The option number 1 is to say there are 35,000 dead in Palestine, over 100,000 injured. And if the ummah is and cannot wake up, then maybe that should be the end of the khutbah. The truth is, there is no ummah. We don't have an ummah. An ummah is something that is incepted. But it is incepted or created in relation to how we see one another. I began by speaking about the crisis of language, yeah? If you ask Muslims and you ask non-Muslims who speak English, what is the word for submission? What is the word? How do you translate Islam in English? The first thing they will say is submission. Islam does not mean submission. Because if you translate submission in Arabic, the word that you will have is khudu'a, a completely different word. Islam comes from the root sallama, sin, lam, mim, 3 Arabic letters to form a verb, sallama, to willfully deliver, to deliver upon choice, to deliver upon critical thinking. The reason that this is mistranslation exists is because Muslims neither understand the English language, nor do we understand our own language. And it was translated in English this way to try and give the impressions that Muslims do not think, they do not reflect. Because when you submit to something, it suggests that you don't think, you just simply submit. But when you translate it in the form sallama from the root sin, lam, mim, it suggests that you are delivering yourself upon critical thinking. You are delivering yourself upon choice, upon reflection, upon using your mind, your aql. The same thing with regards to anarchism. Anarchism in English, when it's translated, is translated as anarchy, as chaos. In Arabic, it's translated as fawdawiyya, to suggest anarchy and chaos. The actual translation of anarchism is la sultawiyya, without authority. So let me stop there, but this is an indication of how words have been placed on our tongues that we don't know the meaning of, and we'll repeat these words over and over again. And I will add on to this after Fatima does a little bit of translating.
Ok. Allora, Mohammed dice che è molto ironico il fatto che si parli della madre terra in molte sure del Corano che prendono il nome proprio da elementi naturali o elementi che fanno parte della dunia, tipo il tuono, le stelle, la luna, l'elefante, la formica, il sole, eccetera. E l'obiettivo di questo dovrebbe forse essere riflettere sulle nostre responsabilità nei confronti della Terra. La nostra specie è divenuta molto arrogante e pensa di essere in cima alla catena alimentare, ma in realtà è in fondo perché si basa su tutto quello che ha attorno, senza cui non può nemmeno respirare. E le persone musulmane spesso non riflettono su queste cose. Aspetta, ho saltato un pezzo forse. Da qua non abbiamo tradotto la parte di collegamento. Sì, no, da qua, va bene, riparto da prima.
Allora, integralo.
Sì, lo integro. Allora, infatti ci sono tre momenti cioè tre cose che distinguono il momento attuale. La prima è che la Terra ha il tempo contato, infatti c'è il cambiamento climatico e molto spesso la Terra non può distinguere tra un colonizzatore, un suprematista bianco e un attivista indigeno. La seconda cosa è che siamo in un momento in cui vediamo un genocidio facendo scrolling sul nostro telefono e questo telefono viene dai frutti di un altro genocidio che è quello del Congo e in più c'è il genocidio degli Uiguri. E il terzo è il fatto che ci sono in questo momento tantissime armi di distruzione di massa che sono cominciate con le bombe atomiche di Hiroshima e Nagasaki. E appunto per questo è importante riflettere su come la Terra sostiene la vita umana. E in Palestina in questo momento ci sono stati 45.000 morti e 100.000 feriti e ci sono persone che moriranno costantemente anche prima della fine di questa khutba. Non abbiamo una umma che sia solida e solidale. L'Islam non significa sottomissione, perché sottomissione in arabo è khudwa, ma viene dalla radice slama che significa libertà di scelta di pensiero critico. Però le persone musulmane o non musulmane diranno che Islam significa sottomissione, perché in un certo senso capiscono l'inglese meglio che le proprie lingue, però questo fa pensare che i musulmani non pensano e si sottomettono, mentre se si considera la vera radice islama, si capisce che ci si basa su una scelta, sulla riflessione e sul pensiero critico. Allo stesso tempo l'anarchismo viene tradotto in arabo come caos molto spesso, ma in realtà andrebbe tradotto con il termine la sultawiyya che significa assenza di autorità. Ci siamo?
Why anarchism? Islam does not have a central authority or a church. There is no priesthood in Islam. The same thing with Judaism, by the way. Unlike Western Christianity or your American Christianity, there is no central church. What is the governing model that exists within Islam? And this will be what I'll be discussing. The first principle that exists in Islam is Tawheed. When you become a Muslim, the first thing you do is Shahada, what is known as Aqidat al-Tawheed. You say, La ilaha illallah Muhammadun Rasulullah, there's only one God. And you pledge allegiance and sovereignty to only one God. The state requires you to pledge allegiance to that state. Pledging allegiance to Allah means you do not pledge allegiance to your family, to your community, to your state, to your nation, to your blood, nothing. Otherwise, you are engaging in kufr. A body can only have one heart. It doesn't have two hearts. But Islam also lays other anti-authoritarian concepts, because if you worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and you worship no authority but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then this is an anti-authoritarian commitment. But there are other commitments. For example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala conceives of all of us as khulafa, as caretakers of the land. We're all equal that way. Allah commands that we engage in shura, which is mutual consultation. There is actually a chapter in the Quran referred to as Surah Shura, mutual consultation. Ijma', which is a Muslim concept, means community consensus. Maslaha, which means public welfare. You see, unlike the state that functions through a politics of rights, because the state is a hierarchical system, a vertical system, Islam conceives of governance on a horizontal scale. And Muslims are supposed to internalize and practice these concepts of shura, of ijma', of maslaha, of tawheed. The concept of the caliphate, you will often hear, oh, Muslims want the Muslim caliphate, is not a necessary model within Islam. Why? Because the caliphate developed, or the idea of the caliphate developed later after the Prophet ﷺ had passed away. What the Prophet had founded was not an Islamic state, because the state is a modern European colonial concept of organizing the world, of organizing society. So when you hear people saying Islamic State, that concept didn't exist, and I will talk about that in a little bit. When you hear the term caliphate actually comes from the concept of khulafa, in the plural, not in the singular form. So it is one that is invented, forgive me. In Islamic anarchism, and in Islam itself, if we are all khulafa, so why is there a need for a single leader? There isn't. The Prophet ﷺ founded what is referred to as the Ummah. The Ummah was grounded in what is referred to as Mithaq al-Medina, the Medina Charter. The Ummah, besides Allah being sovereign, the manifestation of sovereignty on earth is through the concept of Ummah. The Prophet ﷺ founded an Ummah. The Ummah included Muslims, Jews, Sabians, Zoroastrians, Christians, and so on and so forth. All who were bound together, all who were tied together vis-a-vis shared ethical, political, and spiritual commitments. Ethical, political, and spiritual commitments. Anchored within the Medina Charter. The word Islam or Muslimin to refer to Muslims is actually referred or used 5 or 6 times only in the Quran. The emphasis is on the word mu'minin, believers. The word mu'minin or the term mu'minin translates to believers. In my work, what I sought to establish or to found using the Quran, that this interpretation of Islam and anarchism is based upon, what are the characteristics that define the believer, regardless of the name? Nowadays, if somebody comes and says to me, I'm Muslim, I'm queer, I'm Jew, I'm this and that, that means nothing to me. Because the characteristic of the believer is defined by certain ethical political commitments. What I mean by that is, for example, you could be Muslim and Zionist. There are many of those nowadays. You could be Jewish and Zionist. You could be all kinds of things. So telling somebody that you're a Muslim means absolutely nothing. You could be Muslim and misogynist and patriarchal and so on and so forth. So my question becomes, what are the characteristics of the believer? Because there are different paths to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And when one traces that in the Quran, one finds that the characteristic of the believer, the difference between a believer and a disbeliever, the disbeliever is the one who engages in excess, who upholds injustice, who corrupts the earth. And one can see this in many verses in the Quran. For example, chapter 2, Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 251, chapter 7, verse 56, and so on and so forth. So I'll stop there and let Fatimata.
Ok, allora, Mohamed ci ha spiegato che perché l'anarchismo nell'Islam, perché un anarchismo islamico. L'Islam non ha il concetto di autorità, e non come per esempio il cristianesimo americano, comunque non ha una chiesa centralizzata, e anche il giudaismo non ha un concetto di autorità centrale. però nell'Islam ci sono dei principi molto forti, come per esempio il principio del Tawhid, dell'unicità di Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, che viene riconosciuto anche nella Shahada, in cui si riconosce Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala e non altre autorità che possono essere la famiglia, un'autorità politica o qualunque altra
Il
tipo di autorità.
sangue, cioè.
Se no, si tratta di kufr, di un'associazione di altre entità, cioè di altre realtà. Mentre cioè, il corpo ha un solo cuore, in un certo senso, e questo significa che se si prega Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala e nessun'altra autorità, questo è già un principio anarchico. Poi per quanto riguarda invece le forme di politiche più anarchiche dell'Islam, ci sono per esempio il concetto di consultazione, shura, di ijma, cioè di consenso, c'è un concetto di welfare attraverso il masla, il bene della comunità, perché non è un concetto in cui c'è uno Stato verticale che dà una politica dei diritti, perché lo Stato verticale è una creazione coloniale, moderna, europea, e allo stesso modo anche il concetto di califfato è un concetto inventato. Infatti non è un modello necessario, tanto che non c'era quando il profeta era in vita, ma dopo la sua morte. E quindi il concetto di Stato islamico è assolutamente superfluo e artefatto in un certo senso. Il concetto, non può esserci un califfato anche perché non può esserci un'autorità politica, perché siamo tutti khulafa, cioè appunto caretakers, custodi della terra. È un termine che viene infatti usato al plurale e non al singolare, proprio per rendere come lo siamo tutti e non ce ne sia uno solo. E la Umma è la manifestazione della sovranità sulla terra e è fatta appunto dal corpo di tutti i credenti. La Umma di quando c'era il profeta comprendeva tutti gli zoroastriani, i sabei, i musulmani, i cristiani, gli ebrei. Infatti il termine muslim nel Corano c'è solo 6 volte, mentre mu'minin, che è credenti, è molto più ricorrente. E infatti questo concetto di mu'min indica un impegno spirituale, etico e politico condiviso, che era espresso nella Carta di Medina, ai tempi del profeta. Le caratteristiche del credente non sono tanto una religione, ma un impegno etico-politico. Ci sono vari percorsi per arrivare alla subhanahu wa ta'ala, ma ciò che conta è l'impegno etico-politico. Mohamed ci ha fatto degli esempi come ci sono dei musulmani sionisti, ci sono anche degli ebrei sionisti, ci sono dall'altra parte musulmani queer, ci sono musulmani misogini, e però invece il concetto di miscredente implica un senso di ingiustizia, eccesso, corruzione anche della terra, un elemento che è molto presente in tanti versetti della seconda sura al-Baqarah e anche della settima sura. E quindi appunto la differenza tra credenti e miscredenti non è la religione, ma è questo impegno etico-politico. No.
Like I said, there is no concept of the Islamic state. The state is a modern colonial concept. Of course, we can sit down and talk about Sykes-Picot, the division of predominantly Arab and Muslim land into Egypt and into Syria, to Lebanon, into Jordan, and so on to Palestine. But there is no such thing as a state, insofar as an Islamic state. When you ask Arabs who speak Arabic, even ISIS, when it came to find or found itself, it referred to itself as a Dawla al-Islamiyya. If you ask Arabs, is there a word for state in Arabic? The first thing they will say is Dawla or Duwayla. The reality is, in fact, is that Arabs never had a term for state. There isn't an Arabic concept of a state. The term Duwayla actually comes from the Quran. We didn't have a word for state, so we took a word from the Quran, Duwayla, that means the opposite of state, and started to use it as a state, as the term for the state. The reality is, Duwayla actually, for those who actually understand Arabic, stems from two verbs. It lies between two verbs, dar, to rotate, and zal, to go away. For example, Surah Al-Hashr, chapter 59, verse 7, speaks of the Prophet's distribution of the spoils of war, so that they can make a circulation amongst those of the community. Another example, for instance, is that duwayla is being used in such a sense that sometimes you have your health, sometimes you don't have your health. So it's meant to suggest something that changes, that is temporal, that evolves. A state has fixed borders. It's static, it is not dynamic. And yet, like I said, because we didn't have a term for state, a word for state, we took this word from the Quran that means the opposite of state and started to use it as a state. This is the poverty of our imagination. This is how we are misguided and how we are colonized in our hearts and our minds. There are many examples that I could give of that nature. Because traditionally, insofar as Muslim history, in pre-modern history, the Ummah composed itself as a confederacy. With me saying that, by the way, I am not saying and suggesting that modern or pre-modern Muslim history is pure or that we should romanticize it. Muslims have committed a lot of injustices to themselves as well as to others. So this needs to be very clear. What I am seeking, though, in my work is to extract the original essence of social justice, of ethical, political, spiritual commitments that the original polity, the original community, the original ummah of the Prophet ﷺ was founded in relationship to other people who were Muslim and others who were believers and not necessarily Muslim. That is the guiding principle. And I'll stop there and then I'll tell you a story.
Ok, allora, Mohamed ci ha detto che appunto non c'è uno Stato islamico perché è un concetto coloniale moderno, a cui anche si rifanno gli stati arabi moderni che non sono stati islamici. E, spesso questi stati si definiscono come Dawla Islamia, che però non è un concetto di Stato, anche se perché viene dal Corano, è stato preso in prestito come Stato, ma in realtà viene da due verbi che sono l'opposto di Stato, che sono dar, cioè essere radicato, zal, andare via, muoversi, e indicano per esempio in 59.7 la circolazione nella comunità, o anche per esempio che a volte sia la salute, in altri casi non la sia, mentre lo Stato è statico, non è dinamico. E la parola coranica è opposta a questo significato statico dello Stato. Ciò rivela come molto spesso il fatto di avere una mentalità colonizzata o di essere traviati da questa mentalità colonizzata fa sì che anche si abbia un'immaginazione limitata di quali possono essere le forme di governo dello Stato. La Ummah è stata storicamente molto spesso una forma confederativa. Ciò non significa romanticizzare la storia moderna o premoderna islamica, perché le persone musulmane stesse hanno commesso tra di loro in questa storia anche precoloniale forme di ingiustizia, però è più ricercare i significati originari della prima comunità politica e dei termini a cui si riferiva.
Thank you, Fatimata. I think I've exhausted you. The next part of the khutbah, or the second part of the khutbah, I'm going to become a little bit polemical now. Engage in propaganda. We're in the business of propaganda. And I'm not going to lie to you about that. I'm going to tell you a story. You cannot free Palestine without freeing Turtle Island, without freeing here. 1492 is a very significant year in the world. There are two things that happened in 1492. Muslims and Jews, their first persecution, their murder, their first conversion, their raping, their pillaging, by Ferdinand and Isabel in Andalusia, in Spain, modern Spain. Muslims and Jews were referred to as savages and heathens. Savage being the racial descriptor, heathen being the religious descriptor. And of course, Muslims had gone through and continue to go through the Crusades. The war on terror is a continuing crusade. George Bush said it, so let's not play games here. This is a religious war, and anybody who tells you that this is not a religious war, does not know what they're talking about, is lying to you or is lying to themselves. Something else happened in 1492. Columbus's conquistador invasion of the Americas. When Columbus invaded the Americas, he referred to the weapons that were used by the Taino people as alfanges. Alfanges is the Spanish word for scimitars, which is the weapons that Muslims used against the Crusades. Columbus was not just searching for riches. Columbus was trying to find a way back to Jerusalem, to Al-Quds. When Hernan Cortez, the Spanish conquistador, when he and the Crusaders were invading, he referred to Aztec women as Moorish women. He referred to the 400 Aztec temples as Moorish mosques. He referred to Montezuma, the Aztec leader, as a sultan. The new world is built in the image of the old. This is the logic that was guiding the establishment of a settler colony here. It began, and this is why I started by saying, by engaging in indigenous genocides, and then engaging in enslavement that is still ongoing. A third to a fifth of the transatlantic slaves that were enslaved were Muslims from the Iberian Peninsula and the west coast of Africa, were Muslims. People here want to believe that this is a secular society, in God we trust on the dollar bill. What secularism? We pledge allegiance that we shall protect this nation against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And we pledge to the sovereignty of the US that acts and that wants us to worship her, to say, God bless America. What secularism? How can we then say that religion is not part of the equation? This is a religious war, not between Muslims and Jews, but one that Muslims and Jews have been conscripted into. How? Vis-a-vis white crusading imprints on Islam in the form of Wahhabism and Muslim Brotherhood thought, and on Judaism vis-a-vis Zionism and the manifestation of Zionism. But this is a religious war. I'll stop there and then I'll...
Allora, il 1492 è un anno spartiacque perché accadono due eventi concomitanti. Da una parte i musulmani e gli ebrei vengono perseguitati da Isabella di Castiglia in Spagna e ci sono anche le crociate che inaugurano una guerra religiosa. E dall'altra parte Colombo invade le Americhe con la sua spedizione. E in realtà gli immaginari dei due eventi spesso si sovrappongono, perché per esempio le armi che venivano utilizzate da Italia, i primi gruppi autoctoni che Colombo incontra, venivano riferite come scimitarre, che erano le armi che usavano i musulmani. Colombo stava cercando una strada per Al-Quds, per Gerusalemme, e in più molto spesso le donne indigene dell'America venivano riferite come donne...
More.
Sì,
More.
ma com'è il termine?
Moriscos.
Sì, esatto.
More.
Cioè, sì, ok, avete capito. E poi anche i templi degli Aztechi venivano riferiti a come costruzioni religiose islamiche, e allo stesso tempo il Montezuma, l'imperatore dell'impero azteco, veniva definito un sultano. in queste dinamiche di genocidio e di schiavitù non solo gli immaginari si sovrappongono, ma molto spesso anche i primi schiavi deportati erano o musulmani della Spagna oppure della costa occidentale dell'Africa, quindi erano persone musulmane. Il secolarismo è una sorta di illusione che in realtà nasconde il venerare gli Stati Uniti, soprattutto, con frasi anche, per esempio, che ricalcano questo immaginario come Dio benedica l'America. Quindi chi dice che questa non è una guerra religiosa mente o noi o se stesso, non nel senso che è una guerra contro, cioè di musulmani contro ebrei, ma nel senso che in quanto comunità religiose discriminate, musulmani e ebrei sono stati trascinati in una guerra contro sia appunto le strutture imperialiste, sia le loro stesse strutture imperialiste come il sionismo o la fratellanza musulmana, per esempio.
Wahhabite,
Sì,
per
wahhabiti.
esempio.
We have to understand, as many Pan-Africanists, Nkrumah, Patrice Lumumba, Thomas Sankara, Walter Rodney, Kwame Ture, who had said that our people, Africans, and people in the global south have never seen religion as the opium of the masses. That comes directly out of European culture. For African people, religion and revolution go hand in hand. If one is truly religious, one must be revolutionary. The problem on the left nowadays is, of course, it's very anti-religious. It's Islamophobic, it's anti-Jewish, it's anti-Christian, it's a lot of things. Although we have so many examples in history of religious leftists, Nat Turner, Malcolm X, MLK, Tolstoy, Shariati, Dorothy Day, Jacques Ellul, and these are just to name a few. And we have Muslim, Jewish, Christian, Buddhist, socialisms, anarchisms, and Marxisms. But the left has internalized, particularly the left in the West, because it is mostly white, and because it comes from oppressive, Christian, hierarchical, white backgrounds, totalizing or essentializing perspective with regards to religion. It can't distinguish between the concept of religion, deen in Islam, faith, which is iman in Islam, and spirituality, ruhaniya. These are three interrelated concepts that are not one and the same thing. There's a difference between institutionalized faith and non-institutionalized faith, particularly given what I said with regards to Islam. And this is a big problem. This is a big problem because when people are out on the streets right now, we see mobilization. We're not seeing organization. So let's talk a little bit of revolution. There's a difference between mobilization and organization. Right now on the streets, and I'm sure in Italy, I'm sure over here, I know over here, you have conservative Muslims who are against critical race theory, who are queerphobic, who are against feminism, side by side with queer Muslims and feminist Muslims. By them are anti-Zionist Jews. By them are Islamophobic and anti-religious leftists. And everybody is saying free, free Palestine. And everybody's projecting meanings and ideas of Palestine from their own ideological positions without talking about the differences between them. Organization involves understanding structures. So it means understanding what settler colonialism is. Is the return of land in Palestine halal, but not here, given the fact that this is also stolen land? This becomes the hypocrisy. I am a Zionist on stolen land. Settlers are Zionists on stolen land here. So what does that mean? Because, and given that America is leading this war, America is not an innocent bystander. This becomes the problem. We sit down and we talk about the end of capitalism. Most of us don't even know how to grow our own food. We live in the urban metropolis. We don't know how to grow our own food to feed ourselves, our families, our communities, our friends, our neighbors. Who controls the land? If you look at the context of the US, it's the white farmer who is armed and who feeds the metropolis. Black, indigenous, and people of color don't know how to grow food. So what's the end of capitalism? There is no creation of alternatives. You talk about Tahrir Square. Look at the Islamophobia that leftists, feminists, liberals internalized. And that they produced in 2013 when they encouraged the slaughter of the Muslim Brotherhood. And I'm not a fan of the Muslim Brotherhood, but I was there in the two sit-ins of the Muslim Brotherhood, Al-Rab'a and Al-Nahda, when I saw it with my own eyes. Why? Because they wanted Western democracy. They didn't want to go back to their own traditions to work through from a cultural perspective, from even a propagandist perspective. I don't care if you don't believe in God. That's irrelevant. But if you're a revolutionary, you have to know how to talk to your own people. You have to know how to talk to a predominantly Muslim society. This becomes the dilemma. This is the reproduction of fascism over and over again. This is why I was saying that fascism is a mass psychology. When people were saying, well, Trump is a fascist. Trump is not a fascist. Trump is a totalitarian. He wanted to become like Xi. He wanted to become like Kim Jong-un. He wants to become like Putin. Totalitarianism, like Hannah Arendt said, operates from the top down. Fascism is the cancer that we must all fight. This is why jihad in nafs in Islam, the greater jihad, becomes so important. My patriarchy, my matriarchal privileges, my class privileges are internalized by me, and I have to fight them till the day that I die because of how I've been socialized by daddy and mommy. This is what becomes important. Nobody's born a fascist. Mohamed Abdou, the political prisoner, said that our children come from immortality and they are the arrows that we shoot towards infinity. They are what come from immortality and they are the arrows that we shoot towards infinity. They're innocent. I was never an I when I was in my mother's womb. I was we within her womb. I ate through my mother. I breathed through her. I even defecated through her. My entire life was in symbiotic existence in relationship to her. It wasn't until I was born and the umbilical cord that tied me with my mother was severed that I became an individual, that I became a monster. Why? Because I learned how to be selfish. I learned how to not connect with land. Muslims are born not in the condition of original sin. Muslims are born in the condition of the fitrah. We are born with the condition to connect with land, to love, to care, to appreciate the flower, the rose, the grass that grows out of a concrete pavement of stone that says a big FU to civilization and modernity, that I existed before you and I shall exist after you. But we learn to become selfish. We learn to become materialist. We learn to covet and want power. I know the solution to a free Palestine. I know the solution to a free Turtle Island. We become arrogant. I'll stop there and then I'll continue.
Allora. Sì. Allora, dobbiamo capire come molti panafricanisti, per esempio Lumumba, Sankara, eccetera, che la religione in contesti non europei, per esempio appunto nei contesti africani, non è l'oppio delle masse, ma anzi la religione e la rivoluzione vanno insieme. Molto spesso nella storia ci sono stati persone religiose di sinistra, per esempio ci sono i socialismi e i marxismi religiosi come il cristianesimo marxista, l'Islam marxista, il socialismo marxista e questo, cioè il socialismo islamico, cose così. Però la maggior parte delle persone di sinistra in Occidente sono persone bianche che sono che totalizzano il concetto di religione perché l'hanno vissuto in modo gerarchico come è il cristianesimo e quindi non distinguono tra la religione, la fede e la spiritualità che possono essere elementi che sono istituzionalizzati o non istituzionalizzati, ma vedono proprio la religione come elemento istituzionalizzato. Anche tra le persone, tra i movimenti che stanno scendendo in piazza ora, bisogna distinguere la mobilitazione dall'organizzazione. Da una parte c'è la mobilitazione, cioè nelle piazze adesso ci sono persone con anime molto diverse, cioè possono esserci musulmani anti-gender e anti-teorie critiche sul razzismo. Dall'altra parte possono esserci persone anti-queer, persone conservatrici, persone invece islamofobe, e tutte parlano di Palestina libera, ma ognuno proietta il proprio progetto politico sulla Palestina. L'organizzazione invece consiste nel capire qual è la struttura dello Stato coloniale e che non c'è differenza tra la Palestina e gli Stati Uniti. Mohamed ci faceva l'esempio di perché, per esempio, il ritorno della terra per un musulmano conservatore può funzionare a livello di Palestina, ma non funziona negli Stati Uniti, non ci pensa. Bisogna concentrarsi su come può finire il capitalismo e su come funziona il sistema. Molto spesso le persone razzializzate stanno nelle metropoli e non crescono il proprio cibo, non coltivano il proprio cibo, che sta nelle mani, la sussistenza praticamente nelle mani di contadini bianchi che controllano la terra, e quindi bisogna concentrarsi sulla creazione di alternative. Per esempio, nelle proteste di Piazza Tahrir c'è stata da una parte un'interiorizzazione anche dell'islamofobia, dall'altra parte la presenza dei fratelli musulmani che dicevano di ritornare alla tradizione e però avevano capacità di, in un certo senso, parlare con tutti in una società a maggioranza musulmana. Senza questa capacità c'è una riproduzione del fascismo ancora. E anche Trump è molto totalitario dall'alto verso il basso in questa riproduzione fascista. E non è che nasciamo fascisti, però abbiamo sia dei privilegi interiorizzati sia la dinamica appunto madre capitalismo, padre Stato che ci crea come se fossimo appunto nel ventre di una madre una esistenza simbiotica, dopodiché si può diventare indipendenti. Nell'Islam non c'è il concetto di peccato originale, quindi non è che si nasce fascisti, si nasce peccatori, ma di fitra, che è una connessione con la terra, un sapere che c'è qualcosa che viene prima e qualcosa che viene dopo, però con questi sistemi in cui siamo inseriti impariamo a diventare egoisti. Okay.
Thank you, Fatimata. I know you're all tired, and I will try and start to conclude because I know it's very late there. And believe me, the khutba was much larger, but inshallah, maybe next time. There's no force on earth that can rival faith, Iman. And faith has been used as a source of evil, and it has also been a source of liberation and strength and revolution. I don't care what you call God. You can call them Mother Earth, you can call them Yahweh, you can call them Buddha, you can call it Allah, you can call it Isa. Doesn't matter. The question is, what are the ethical, political, spiritual commitments? And I say spiritual for this reason. Land is a spiritual subject. She's not an object. She's not property. How can you connect the land? How can you free land without spirit? How can you love without spirit? How can you engage in any revolutionary act without spirit? And let me push the analysis even further, and all these things and a lot more are discussed in the book. Is Marxism has it not become a religion? Has Marx not become a prophet? Have Bakunin, Kropotkin, and Emma Goldman also not become prophets? I'll tell you a story. I was once at an anarchist conference 10 years ago, and a white man in a suit, I don't know how you can be an anarchist in a suit, but that's besides the point, said to me in a conference, I made effigies of Prophet Muhammad, of Isa, of Musa, and I burnt them. How does that make you feel? I don't know how Prophet Muhammad or Isa or Musa looked, beyond, of course, the depiction of Isa as a blonde-haired, blue-eyed man. But let me ask you a question, I said back. If I made effigies of Emma Goldman, of Bakun and Kropotkin, and I would never do this, and I burnt them, how would that make you feel? And he said, these are our gods. You see the irony there. You see the problem there. You have to understand, what I argue in the book is that as much as I love anarchism as a political philosophy, I believe that Islam is inherently anarchistic. It's sort of like saying, am I Muslim anarchist or am I Muslim feminist? Well, what if I believe that Islam is inherently feminist? What if I believe that Islam is inherently anarchistic? This becomes the idea. So identity politics become very limited. Choose. This is the liberal identity politics. BIPOC, are you black or indigenous or people of color? As if you can't be black and people of color, as if you can't be black and indigenous. But choose. Are you LGBTIQ? Choose. This is how European modernity structures our sense of identity. Compartmentalize, incarcerate, imprison yourself within these identities. So I can identify you and so that you become identifiable to others. Oh, Mohammed is this or that. No, Muhammad isn't this or that. I'm not a binary. I'm a set of conjunctive ands. I'm Muslim and anarchist and feminist and. I'm everything I know will never come to know and haven't come to reject yet. Jihad is a collective struggle. Because when I'm fighting my microfascisms, I need community. And that community needs to be in a different environment. It needs to be on land. I need to be able to be called in by my sisters, by my brothers, by my family, by my siblings. And ijtihad is also a collective struggle. I arrive at this interpretation vis-a-vis ijtihad, the critical use of reasoning. And ijtihad is a gift by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to every Muslim. So long as they strive, so long as they struggle, which is to engage in critical reasoning with regards to the Quran. Of course, there are certain methodologies, there are certain practices that need to be accompanied, but that's the right of every Muslim to do. Again, we don't have a priesthood. And we have to acknowledge, and this is part of reality, that Muslims, particularly Arabs, even Southwest Asians, have internalized anti-Blackness, despite the fact that we have Black Muslim histories and Black Muslim empires. We fed into, as Muslims, into Arab supremacy, Sunni supremacy, Shiite supremacy, and so on. My choices right now in the world will not be between a Zionist crusading Wahhabi alliance and a Russian, Chinese, totalitarian axis. These are not going to be my choices. I refuse these choices. These are choices that even the left plays into because they are searching for a multipolar world, because they would like to see your American hegemony, NATO, and so on and so forth destroyed. But in exchange for what? This is why I said at the beginning, what are we fighting against and what are we fighting for? This becomes the question. America, when it came to treating indigenous people, this America, she placed them on reservations. When it came to Japanese people, she put them in internment camps, as Jeremiah Wright had noted. When it came to Black people, America put them on auction blocks. She put them in chains. She put them in slave quarters. She put them in cotton fields, in bad housing, substandard housing. She exposed them to the lowest paying jobs outside equal protection of the law. She conceives of them, she thinks of them, of Black people and indigenous and people of color, as unworthy of higher education. America has locked people of color and the world into positions of hopelessness and helplessness, bigger prisons. And she wants us to sing, God bless America. And of course, Europe follows. Let me conclude by talking a little bit about revolution. For a revolutionary movement to be revolutionary, it has to have three things. And if it doesn't have them, and of course, examples like the Zapatista exist. The Zapatista movement in Chiapas, that is anti-statist, that rose in 1994 and that I spent time with. A revolutionary movement has to have three things. If a movement is serious. Number one, you need to create alternatives. Revolutions are about practical questions. What are you going to do when somebody gets sick? What are you going to do for food? What are you going to do with the police? What are you going to do with the army? Practical questions. What are you going to do, and have you created alternatives? Clinics, alternative schools outside the universities, which are colonial institutions, hierarchical institutions, patriarchal institutions. The way that academia structures biology is separate than physics is separate than chemistry, sociology is separate from gender studies is separate from this, and so on and so forth. This is a European mode of knowing, of living, of understanding the world. But we all know that you can't be a good sociologist or biologist without understanding chemistry and physics. Traditionally, people of color's ways of knowing were very pluriverse. There were multiple. Number two, you need propaganda. Alternative ways of thinking, books, documentaries, filmmaking, art, cinema. You need to be able to raise a new generation anew, to think differently, to act differently, to be differently. Revolutions are learning how to rebreathe differently, how to eat differently, how to touch differently, how to engage in a different kind of intimacy, how to love differently. Number three, the preparation for armed defense, because once you build your alternatives and once you have your propaganda, the state and capitalism will never allow you to just to live. But defense as a tactic, not as a strategy, not like Daesh. This becomes the key. The Quran says, وَأَعِدُّوا لَهُم مَّا اسْتَطَعْتُم مِّن قُوَّةٍ, and prepare what it is that is necessary to fight your enemies. So you need to prepare. The left loves to talk. It loves to engage in slogans. Millions of people went out during the anti-war protests in Iraq and Afghanistan. I was one of them 20 years ago. 20 years ago. Did that change? Did that stop the Iraq war? No. Organization is different. The left needs to be quiet, and people need to organize and build alternatives, because otherwise, what are you defending? And alternatives to be able to show our people. This was the mistake of Tahrir Square. People didn't have alternatives. People pointed at Mubarak and said, down with the regicide. But there's a mini Mubarak, there's a mini Obama, mini Bush inside each of us, in our hearts, in our minds. So we need to transform, we need to build something different. And that has to happen on the land. And this is very difficult. This is not easy to do. Why? Because we've all internalized stereotypes of one another. The white man in relationship to me in relationship to a woman, and so on. So we need to learn to get to know one another. We need to develop an ethics of disagreement, conflict resolution, instead of tearing each other apart. Marxists hate anarchists, anarchists hate feminists, this hates that, and so on and so forth. In Islam, it's referred to as usul al-ikhtilaf, the ethics of disagreement. But we need to also offer each other a politics of hospitality. How do we get to know one another again? It's not easy, yeah? When you live with a lover, you discover that they don't want to do the dishes, or they don't want to clean, or even when you live with friends, it creates tensions. So imagine living in a community. The problems of the ego, the problems that happen in everyday life. I'll stop there and then, inshallah, I'll conclude.
Ok, riassumiamo un po', direi, così stringiamo un attimo. Allora, per quanto riguarda invece gli elementi di soluzione a tutta questa analisi e problemi, non c'è una forza sulla terra che sia rivale della fede, dell'iman. La fede è una forza molto forte, che può essere sia usata in negativo per l'opinione delle persone, sia però una forza di rivoluzione e liberazione. Non importa in realtà in cosa credi, in chi credi, ma qual è il tuo impegno etico, politico e spirituale, soprattutto nei confronti della terra, che è un soggetto e non è un oggetto, va considerata tenendo conto del suo spirito. Il marxismo e l'anarchismo non sono religioni perché non hanno dei profeti. L'anarchismo è una teoria politica, però può essere, come il femminismo, intrinseca all'Islam. Non dobbiamo basarci su delle identità compartimentalizzate sul modello europeo che vedono una cosa o l'altra cosa, eccetera. Si può essere un insieme di cose, anche l'Islam può essere tante cose. La jihad è un impegno collettivo che connette le persone. e che riguarda il combattere i propri microfascismi con la comunità, perché non è un lavoro che si può fare da solo, in quanto la comunità può farci dei pull-in e può darci una prassi quotidiana di superare questi microfascismi. Il jihad si intende qui come uso critico della ragione, che è qualcosa che Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala dà a tutte le persone. Purtroppo nel nostro contesto c'è tantissima da parte dei musulmani anche anti-blackness interiorizzata, oppure suprematismo arabo o suprematismo sunnita piuttosto che sciita. E qui si ritorna un po' alle domande iniziali. Infatti, cioè, non è che dobbiamo scegliere tra diversi suprematismi o diversi sistemi totalizzanti, che siano arabo, russo, cinese o americano. Ci vuole un rifiuto di queste logiche anche dello sfruttamento del mondo multipolare e bisogna chiedersi contro cosa stiamo lottando e per che cosa stiamo lottando. L'America struttura tantissime pressioni nei confronti delle persone indigene e nere e anche nel resto delle persone razzializzate nel resto del mondo, e poi vuole sentirsi dire God bless America. L'Europa segue a ruota allo stesso modo, ma la risposta può essere solo una rivoluzione che riguardi tre elementi, come per esempio c'è nel Chiapas nel 1994 c'è stato questo movimento anti-Stato. Deve riguardare un creare delle alternative concrete riguardo proprio come prendersi cura dei propri membri, cioè per esempio sul cibo, su chi si ammala, sulla scuola. Ad esempio le università sono entità estremamente coloniali. Bisogna superare il mondo della conoscenza europea, creare cose al di fuori che si basino anche molto di più sulla molteplicità e non sulla compartimentalizzazione del sapere su un modello coloniale. Dall'altra parte bisogna elaborare una propaganda, cioè degli altri modi di pensare e anche di divulgare le informazioni in modo da poter crescere una generazione che pensi in modo diverso, che agisca in modo diverso, che parli in modo diverso, che ami in modo diverso, che studi in modo diverso. E poi bisogna organizzare delle forme di difesa contro lo Stato e il capitalismo, ma una difesa non strategica di opposizione sul modello di Daesh, ma una difesa tattica. E per questo serve l'organizzazione, perché l'organizzazione rispetto alla mobilitazione può permettere di creare delle alternative. Mohamed ci ha fatto l'esempio delle proteste contro la guerra in Afghanistan e in Iraq 20 anni fa, che sono state delle grandi mobilitazioni, ma non hanno fermato la guerra. Quindi la sinistra dovrebbe piuttosto organizzare e costruire delle alternative. Piazza Tahrir è stato per esempio fallimentare perché non aveva delle alternative. C'era un opporsi a Mubarak, ma se non siamo Mubarak ha un'alternativa religiosa in un certo senso, però che non decostruiva i propri mini Mubarak, mini Trump interiorizzati.
Mini Bush, mini...
Esatto, mini tutto. E c'erano tantissimi stereotipi, cioè ci sono ancora nelle nostre comunità, nell'interazione tra di noi, tantissimi stereotipi gli uni sugli altri, che sono problematici nel momento in cui si vuole costruire un'alternativa. Però bisogna sviluppare delle politiche dell'ospitalità gli uni verso gli altri. Non è uno sforzo facile, ci sono dei problemi quotidiani già tra le convivenze di poche persone, figurarsi una comunità sono ingigantiti, però è un esercizio da fare.
Last section, if Fatima Tuta. The most important thing in understanding the limitation of historical materialism is the role of metaphysics, of cosmology. In Islam, there is a role for al-ghaib, the unknown. In the Quran, there are verses like in chapter 2, Al-Baqarah, Alif Lam Mim, 3 Arabic letters conjoined or together form an Arabic word. Nobody knows the meaning of this word. This is the wisdom of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to humble Arabs and to humble humanity of what the spirit world, of what land has to teach us. But we have to walk with the land and we have to ask questions of the land. So there are certain things in revolution that we will never be able to anticipate, and why historical materialism, as much as it is a useful analysis, is also very limited. Solidarity is about سياسة المسؤوليات. It's about the politics of responsibility, not rights. You don't have rights until you know what your responsibility is for somebody else. My responsibility is to put my life on the line for indigenous, for Black people, for women, for gender and queer dissidents, as is the responsibility of the white man to place their life on the line. Whiteness is not a phenotype, it's not a color of skin, it's not a pigmentation, because even Black, indigenous, and people of color have internalized cultures of whiteness. So there are Black, brown, red people, skinned people with white masks. They've internalized the white man's words. They're capitalists, they're statists, they're authoritarian. So to me, again, the color of skin is irrelevant. It allows a certain privilege, but it doesn't mean that this is the central essence. What I've sought to do in my work is to continue Malcolm X's project, if I may say. What would Malcolm say about his friendship with James Baldwin, a queer Black man now, insofar as queerphobia? What would Malcolm say about Wahhabism, given the transformation of who and what he was when he went to pilgrimage in Mecca? The beauty about Malcolm is that he was engaged always in change. He was an organizer and not just a mobilizer. The Malcolm before and after prison is not the same as the Malcolm before and after the Nation of Islam, is not the same as the Malcolm before and after Mecca. I use the Quran. I don't identify as a Sunni, as a Shiite, as Ismaili, as a Sufi, as an Ahmadi. All these traditions I respect, but they were all born because one sect in Islam excluded the other. I use the Quran because to me, the Quran, and that doesn't mean that I ignore the Sunnah or the prophetic tradition, the Hadith. I use the Quran because the Quran is the one text that is shared by the Nation of Islam and Ahmadis and Sufis, Shiite, Sunni. All Muslims share the word Quran. And so it becomes to me the measuring stick, the barometer by which I can judge all these different Islams. In trying to interpret an Islam that is anti-capitalist, that is anti-authoritarian, and so on and so forth. Indigenous land defenders in North Dakota a few years ago were referred to as jihadi terrorists by Tiger Swan, a paramilitary, an extension of the paramilitary industrial complex of the US. Like I said, Islamophobia is global. Buddhism has become militarized in Myanmar against the Rohingya. Look at what China is doing with the Uyghur. Look at what Hindutva is being and how it's being mobilized against Dalits and Kashmiris and so on. Everybody's using Islamophobia. Islam is the linchpin, and this is the reason that Islam becomes very important. And why I said that talking about Palestine in the context of 1948 or 1917 is very limiting. Is very limiting because it means that we're accepting the borders as the British had drawn it. This is why 1492 becomes very important, because it connects what happened in the world globally. It connects indigenous and Black and Muslim struggles. It clarifies what happened with Christianity. It clarifies what happens with Islam and with Judaism and with the whole world. Decolonization is a violent act, as Fanon said. Decolonization is inherently violent because it means that we're learning and relearning how to understand our own sense of our own selves and each other, our relationship to land. There's no escaping that violence. And to show you again another example that Muslims don't know, we often in the West and even amongst Muslims, they will say jihad is a scare word. The actual word for fighting in Islam, in the Quran, is qital. That is the actual word to fight in the Quran. Not all forms of jihad are qital, and not all forms of qital are jihad. This becomes very important in terms of decolonizing our minds and unlearning what we learned on our tongues. Let me conclude here by again saying we have the equivalent of 69 COP cities being built in the US right now. A few years ago, 2020, during the pandemic, we said, we're not going back to normal. The whole world said we're not going back to normal. We had the Black Spring, and people yelled and screamed, Black Lives Matter. What, Black Lives Matter don't matter anymore? There's no more George Floyds. There's no more Michael Browns. There's no more Breonna Taylors. There's no more Sandra Bland's. Black people are still being killed. The Arab Spring has come and go. No Dakota has come and go. Now it's Palestine. We're shopping around for solidarity. We have no strategy. We're not thinking about tomorrow. And we're not willing to do what is necessary today to fight for a better tomorrow, not just for ourselves, not for our children, for the land, for our Mother Earth. But she has her own timetable and schedule. We need to act fast and we need to act now. We need to organize. We need to attend to practical questions. Very grateful for you all. I know that this wasn't easy and I know that it's very late in Italy. Let us stop. And I always say this to people, especially over here. People over here have bought into the American dream. They hyphenate themselves. Muslim American, African American, Asian American, Italian American, Irish American, queer American, I don't know what American. The only American that does not hyphenate their names is the white American. They just call themselves the American because they are assumed to be the native of the land. What are we buying into, my sisters and brothers and kins? A white man's world? And what does this mean insofar as the people of color have not their own traditions and ways of governance prior to the so-called European modernity and Enlightenment and the Renaissance, when Europe was in the Dark Ages? We lack dignity. We lack respect. We have to learn how to redream dangerously together again as a people. And it doesn't take millions in the streets. As the Quran says, وَكَمْ مِنْ فِئَةٍ قَلِيلَةٍ غَلَبَتْ فِئَةٍ كَبِيرَةٍ. How much of a small group defeated a larger enemy? The Zapatistas were not large in numbers. The Black Panthers are not large in numbers. Muhammad was not large in numbers. Isa, Jesus, was not large in number. Musa was not large in number. But they changed the world. We need to be like that. But we need to start acting and changing and taking up the responsibility that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blessed us with. Again, I thank you all. And I'll conclude that La ilaha illallah Muhammadun Rasulullah. Allahumma salli wa sallim wa barak ala Sayyidina Muhammad. There is no freeing Palestine without freeing ourselves, without freeing Turtle Island, without freeing Africa. Africa that is the size of the US, Canada, East and West Europe, Japan, and China. That is how big Africa is. So Black Lives Matter have to matter there too. And I will conclude with this verse from the Quran. من أجل ذلك كتبنا على بني إسرائيل أنه من قتل نفسا بغير نفس أو فسادا في الأرض فكأنما قتل الناس جميعا. That we ordained for the children of Israel that whoever takes a life, and thus a punishment for murder or mischief in the land, it will be as if they killed the entirety of humanity. And this is a verse from the Quran. Let us love one another. Let us care for one another. And let us ask now what you and I will do. Now, today, tomorrow. What we will build, what we will create, and what we will dream. The Zapatistas have a wonderful saying. Nobody plans for revolutions, but holding each other's hands, we ask one another what each of us knows. You know something? Teach me. You know something? You know something? This is how we discover the revolution together. Jazakumullah khair again. Thank you for listening. I know that this wasn't easy. Barakallah fiki ya Fatimatuta. And forgive me for my shortcomings, and may what it is that I shared, inshallah, be I hope it was useful. And inshallah, I cannot wait till the Italian translation comes out, because I think you will enjoy the book. It's much more deeper than I have articulated here. So forgive me for not knowing Italian, but inshallah, someday I look forward to being with you all, and to visiting, and to being in your company, and to speaking about the book there. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay,
Okay,
please.
let's... Aspetta, adesso dove vedevo? Allora. Ok. Va bene. Allora, dunque, il materialismo storico ha delle limitazioni, per il fatto che non contempla una metafisica e l'inconoscibile. Per parlare di inconoscibile, Mohamed ha parlato di un verso di Surat al-Baqarah che è Alif Lam Mim, che sono 3 lettere arabe sostanzialmente, e con questi versi il cui contenuto non è insomma un significato, vabbè, una cosa linguistica che non vuol dire niente, però vuol dire tante cose. In pratica è un modo di far capire all'umanità che non è onnipotente in un certo senso, ma che deve riferirsi anche alla terra, a quello che è attorno e all'inconoscibile. Ci sono cose che non possiamo anticipare, in particolare anche come una rivoluzione, quali sono i risultati di una rivoluzione e come strutturarla, non sempre tutto è anticipabile. C'è una questione di responsabilità nei confronti soprattutto delle persone più oppresse, però la bianchezza non riguarda tanto il colore della pelle, non è un elemento centrale quanto più le culture della bianchezza che vengono interiorizzate anche dalle persone oppresse, non solo dalle persone bianche, perché è un mettersi delle maschere bianche. Lui si riferisce al progetto di Malcolm X e pensa a cosa farebbe adesso Malcolm X contro la queerfobia o contro l'islamofobia e tutto. Malcolm X è andato alla Mecca e la Mecca l'ha trasformato da un mobilizzatore, da un mobilitatore a un organizzatore. E Abdou non si identifica in una corrente perché dell'Islam, ma si riferisce al Corano, perché una corrente esclude l'altra, è una frattura che esclude l'altra, mentre il Corano è un testo che è condiviso da un'ampia comunità di musulmani molto diversi e diventa un criterio per giudicare e interpretare. L'islamofobia è un fenomeno globale che ha varie forme, per esempio in Myanmar da parte di gruppi, cioè una maggioranza buddista contro i Rohingya, oppure gli Uiguri in Cina, ma anche in India, quello che sta succedendo. Lui non si riferisce alle date che riguardano la Palestina come 1948 o 1970, perché è importante non accettare quelli che erano i confini inglesi prestabiliti dal colonialismo. Il 1492 invece chiarisce le connessioni e cosa è successo tra quello che è successo con il cristianesimo che si è trasformato nella religione coloniale e invece l'ebraismo e l'Islam. La colonizzazione è un processo inerentemente violento che riconfigura tutte le relazioni tra le persone e con la terra. Il jihad non significa una lotta, cioè un combattimento di guerra, ma anzi appunto significa avere riflessività sulle cose. Molto spesso dobbiamo noi stessi decolonizzare e disimparare le strutture coloniali nelle nostre mentalità, ma anche nelle nostre lingue, imparare i significati delle parole senza basarci sulle traduzioni colonialiste. E purtroppo ci sono molti movimenti, tipo nel 2020 Black Lives Matter aveva detto di non tornare alla normalità dopo la pandemia. Adesso è in declino, anche se ancora tante persone nere sono uccise. Infatti il problema è che molti movimenti non hanno una strategia, ma dobbiamo iniziare a farcela per combattere per il nostro domani e per la terra. Agire adesso, velocemente, organizzarci con delle alternative pratiche. E molto spesso le comunità minoritarie in America sono americanizzate, cioè si definiscono asiatici americani, afroamericani, musulmani americani, arabi americani. Gli unici che non aggettivano sono gli americani bianchi, che si ritengono americani e basta perché pensano che il territorio appartenga a loro. E spesso le proprie tradizioni vengono considerate meno valide della modernità europea, e in questo c'è una mancanza di dignità e di rispetto che va decolonizzata. Nel Corano c'è l'affermazione che anche se si è numericamente pochi, si può combattere un nemico più grande, e quindi è importante essere così e agire responsabilmente e con Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, senza dover per forza fare manifestazioni oceaniche che poi si dissolvono appunto nella mobilitazione, senza appunto diventare organizzazioni con un seguito. Non ci sarà una Palestina libera senza che sia libero il resto del mondo. E nel Corano c'è scritto che chi uccide una persona religiosa è come se uccidesse tutta l'umanità. E quindi è importante imparare gli uni dagli altri cosa può essere la rivoluzione e come si può strutturare, avere uno scambio di saperi e condividere, perché è in questo modo che si può avere la possibilità di un'alternativa. Thank you very much. How do you feel?
Let me stop. Registrazione. Bye. Bye for the future people that will watch this video.